Megaloceros was one of the largest members of the deer family ever to walk the earth. Despite being called the Irish elk, it's actually not very closely related to either of the two species known as elk today. Instead, its closest living relatives seem to be either the red deer or the fallow deer. But we actually know a great deal about what Megaloceros probably looked like in life because it inspired our human ancestors to immortalize it in art. It often appears in cave paintings dating to the late Pleistocene epoch, most famously in Lascaux and Cugnac caves of France. And we know these figures represent Megaloceros because of the one detail that the Ice Age artists took pains to capture: the animal's enormous antlers. Thanks to these depictions, we know a lot of other details about Megaloceros that otherwise we never would have known, like that it had dark stripes that contrasted with its pale head and neck. And attached to its shoulders was a distinctive hump, probably made of fat because it's not on its skeleton. And of course, there were the antlers. At their largest, the antlers of Megaloceros giganteus could reach 3.7 meters wide and weigh up to 45 kilograms. Even today, it holds the record for having the largest antlers of any deer species. Most experts believe that those giant features were used as a signifier during mating season, which resulted in natural selection pressures for larger antlers. But the antlers weren't just prized by females, they may have also been important for humans in many parts of the world. Because these giant deer weren't only found in Ireland, Megaloceros actually lived throughout Europe, Northern Asia, and Northern Africa, and was used by different people in different ways. Many archaeological sites have been found with fragments of antlers that were modified by humans for their use. Take, for example, the site known as Wulan Mulan in Nemongol, China. The site dates back somewhere between 30,000 and 70,000 years ago, and there tools have been found that were made from the antlers of Megaloceros, including things like a hammer. Meanwhile, at sites in Spain and France from just over 30,000 years ago, we found more antler fragments that were modified by humans. And interestingly enough, these fragments appear to have been made from antlers that have been shed, having fallen off before regrowing again the next summer. This implies that humans may have scavenged and collected the antlers rather than just hunting the deer for them. And one of the most unique and frankly coolest artifacts made from Megaloceros material is an intricately carved dagger from around 7,000 years ago, recovered from a peat bog in Russia. But along with providing material for tools, Megaloceros may also have had a special, less tangible significance for humans. Some experts think that the frequent appearance of Megaloceros in cave art and in unusual archaeological contexts, like deep within caves, suggests that his antlers and bones could have been used in shamanistic religious rituals. So if these animals were so valuable to our species, then what happened to them? What went so wrong for Megaloceros? Well, as is the case with many extinctions, the precise cause or causes are still up for debate. The most popular hypothesis is known as the antler theory, and it places the blame on the very thing that made Megaloceros so fascinating and memorable. This idea was first suggested in 1830 by an Irish physician named John Hart, who thought that the massive size of the antlers must have required an equally massive amount of blood to grow and maintain. Once the antlers were shed, he thought there would have been such a rush of blood back into the brain that males may have suffered seizures or strokes. Another idea from the same period was that the antlers were so big that Megaloceros would have constantly gotten tangled up in trees or bodies of water, causing them to either starve or drown. But most of these theories predate the publication of Darwin's On the Origin of Species in 1859, so they don't take into account the concepts of natural selection and adaptation. So by the 1930s, most of these early hypotheses were challenged using allometry, the study of the relationship between body size, shape, and growth rate. And these studies found that the antlers of Megaloceros grew in proportion with the rest of their bodies, so it's not like the headgear could have gotten too big for them to handle. But that doesn't mean that those huge features still weren't a big problem. In the 1990s, a new version of the antler theory emerged, and it's one that scientists actually agreed with. This model suggested that Megaloceros required a lot more nutrients than other megafauna, and that might have contributed to their downfall. Because of their antlers, Megaloceros would need a consistent supply of both calcium and phosphorus in order to restore the nutrients that they lost during growth and shedding. So any slight decline in their food supply would have had an enormous impact on their ability to survive. In addition, the amazing size of the antlers may have made sexual selection very exclusive. If only the males with the very largest antlers were being selected, then the species as a whole might have suffered a fatal drop in genetic diversity. But if Megaloceros have been so successful for thousands of years, then why would his antlers suddenly have become such a drag? As with so many things, the demise of the Megaloceros seems to be ultimately about timing. During their heyday in the Pleistocene epoch, they thrived in extremely cold environments, often living through periods of glaciation followed by slight warming. But in the late Pleistocene, as the climate started to change, Megaloceros populations became increasingly restricted to modern-day Russia. This is likely because the open grazing lands that had once sustained them were now turning into dense forests that the species struggled to survive in. And that brings the antler theory back into play. As the Pleistocene faded, Megaloceros, which was mainly a grazing species, lost its ideal environment for feeding. Populations began to dwindle, especially given that males needed a lot of nutrients to support their oversized headgear. And to make matters worse, the newly forested environment may have made it difficult for deer with larger antlers to get around, which may have also displaced some of the population. So perhaps, because of the combination of high sexual selection and the dwindling population of large antlered males, birth rates began to drop. But the death blow might have been the hunting habits of our own human ancestors, who likely had a taste for Megaloceros. For example, remains of Megaloceros from an early Holocene site in Russia show clear evidence of having been butchered. According to recent radiocarbon data from other remains found in Russia, Megaloceros had completely disappeared around 7,600 years ago. But since then, many more specimens have been discovered, including many that were fished out of Irish peat bogs, where the oxygen-poor environment kept the bones well preserved. And it's not just the remains that have been preserved for all of these years. Depictions of Megaloceros in art and folklore throughout history have kept their memory alive as well. For example, Irish poet Seamus Heaney used the imagery of a Megaloceros skeleton being recovered from a bog as part of his series of poems about the famous bog bodies of Ireland. And Megaloceros also graces the Northern Irish coat of arms to this day, representing the natural environment of the country. Whether in body or spirit, the so-called Irish elk continues to capture our imaginations. And like our ancestors thousands of years ago, we continue to keep them alive through stories and art, reminders of the time when we met this majestic megafauna. Thanks to this month's Eontologists, Patrick Seifert, Jake Hart, John Davison Ing, and Steve. If you'd like to join them and our other patrons in supporting what we do here, then by all means go to patreon.com/eons and make your pledge. Thank you. Thank you for joining me in the Konstantin Haza studio. If megafauna are your thing, then check out our episode, Life, Sex, and Death Among the Dire Wolves. I'd like to start by extending my personal thanks to a certain wolf that lived in North America back in the Pleistocene epoch. He was an average-sized adult male, probably around 65 kilograms, and he'd done a lot of living in his time. He was stalking around what's now Southern California when he and his pack heard a noise, the sound of an animal in distress, maybe a bison or a camel or a ground sloth. So the wolf and his pack went toward the sound, because when you're a wolf, the sound of a prey in distress might as well be a dinner bell. He found the animal stuck in a pit of thick, black, smelly goo, trapped, so he moved in for the kill, until he found himself trapped. Now, I don't know the name of this particular doggo, but I do know that he existed, and scientists refer to one of his bones as LAC-MHC-8291. This wolf was only one of thousands of his species to die in the same spot in Southern California over the course of thousands of years. And I want to thank him because the way in which he and his compatriots died that day has allowed us to learn an incredible amount about their species. Their remains have taught us volumes about how they lived, how they hunted, how they died, and way more about any individual animal's sex life than you'd ever want to know. The specimen known today as LAC-MHC-8291 belonged to the greatest species of wolf that ever lived, the dire wolf. Okay, now, no, this is not a Game of Thrones fanfiction episode. Dire wolves were real. They were among the most impressive members of the family Canidae, which has its roots in North America. Today, canids include wolves, foxes, coyotes, and dogs all over the world. And the biggest canids that ever lived were the Borophagines, also known as the bone-crushing dogs, which I've talked about before. But around 30 million years ago, a new subfamily of canids appeared, Caninae, or canines. They're true dogs. And at first, canines were pretty small, around the size of a fox, which was fine because the bone-crushing dogs and cat-like nimrabids already occupied the role of large predator. So being small let canines take advantage of smaller prey with less competition. It took 23 million years before the ancestors of the dire wolves developed bigger body sizes that could take on bigger prey, with canines the size of coyotes showing up around 12 million years ago. But it wasn't until about 3 million years ago, when the Borophagines were declining, that canines started to become wolf-sized. And the most massive of these was Canis dirus, the dire wolf. It lived in North America from about 840,000 to 11,000 years ago. And it's also found in the fossil record of South America from about 27,000 to 11,000 years ago. So for nearly a million years, dire wolves were widespread and abundant throughout the Americas, found in grasslands and forests, and at elevations as high as 2,200 meters. And because they were so common, we have lots of fossils of them, which has given us an especially vivid understanding of their biology, ecology, and behavior. But no place in the world has shown us the life and death of dire wolves in as lucid detail as the La Brea tar pits, where literally thousands of the remains have been unearthed. And this includes my boy, the owner of the bone-labeled LAC-MHC-8291. Today, these tar pits are smack in the middle of downtown Los Angeles, and it's a fascinating place. It's full of these pools of what's commonly called tar, but is actually naturally occurring asphalt, basically a sticky, viscous version of petroleum. And back in the Pleistocene, these asphalt pits were a textbook example of a predator trap. The pits simply trapped any animals that made the mistake of wading into them. And once trapped, those animals' distress calls would draw predators to the scene. But then their predators would get stuck too, just like that wolf I told you about. And then their calls would in turn summon even more predators. As a result of this grim dynamic, dire wolves are the most common fossil found at La Brea, bar none, with more than 4,000 individuals found so far. That's more than mammoths or saber-tooths or even today's ubiquitous coyotes. And with so many fossils at their disposal, paleontologists have been able to find out an awful lot about dire wolves. For one thing, we know a lot about their true size. The average dire wolf was about 60 to 68 kilograms, which is 28 kilograms heavier than the average of their close cousin, the gray wolf. And it's about 45 kilograms heavier than the average coyote. But even though gray wolves and dire wolves were very different in their average weight, they were probably quite similar in height and length. Dire wolves were just stockier, with stronger bites and broader faces, a bruiser of a wolf. It's likely that packs of dire wolves hunted bison, camels, horses, and other large Pleistocene animals, though probably not adult mammoths. I mean, dire wolves were big, but not that big. But the bones of La Brea can even tell us how dire wolves hunted, and how hard it was in their bodies. Bone injuries in fossils tend to look like areas of strange texture, bumpy and overgrown or with pitted surfaces where bone is normally smooth. Some bone injuries leave marks that are so distinct that scientists can even diagnose specific diseases, like tuberculosis in mammoths, or infections caused by a blow from a stegosaurus' tail, which actually has happened. And many of the dire wolf bones at La Brea turn out to be pathological, meaning they show signs of things like infections, disease, or some sort of developmental deformity. And among those pathological bones, 2% are the result of trauma, like fractures. And one of them is that bone I told you about, LAC MHC 8291. Signs of trauma in dire wolves tend to be in the ankle, the wrist, or the neck, which are typical of pursuit predators. So this suggests that the wolves were getting hurt while chasing down and subduing their prey. And dire wolves in La Brea also have a lot of broken teeth. This probably came from eating the bones of their prey. The bones of big herbivores contain a lot of fat, juicy marrow. And while dire wolves didn't have the jaw strength of their cousins, the Borophagenes, they could still crack open bones. That marrow is just worth the risk of breaking some teeth. And even the unusual number of dire wolves at La Brea tells us a lot about their behavior. About a third of all the specimens at La Brea are Canis dirus. So either they were just incredibly common, or more likely, they're the sort of animal that hunts down animals in distress. Pack hunters. I mean, it's not every predator that hears an animal in distress and decides to check it out. In Africa today, about 85% of the predators that respond to playback tapes of animals in distress are social predators. Predators that hunt in packs. And hunters tend to respond